June 15, 1944. The pre-dawn silence over northern France shattered as Private First Class Thomas Bulge pressed his cheek against the cold metal of his Springfield M1903A4 sniper rifle. Through his scope, he could make out the silhouettes of German machine gun nests that had pinned down 3 companies of the 29th Infantry Division since yesterday afternoon. Rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the Norman countryside into a mud-slicked nightmare. The smell of wet earth mingled with cordite and blood. Bulge's hands tightened around his rifle. His heartbeat slowed as he controlled his breathing, just as his grandfather had taught him years before on the reservation. 1 shot, 1 kill. The Diné way. But this morning was different. The battalion commander had given explicit orders: no sniper fire, radio silence. Wait for the artillery barrage scheduled for 0800 hours. But dawn was approaching. The Germans would move soon, reinforcing their position, and the wounded Americans lying in the field wouldn't survive another 4 hours. "Sir," the radio operator whispered beside him, "we have to follow orders. The big picture." Bulge didn't look away from his scope. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Unwrapping it revealed what looked like a twisted piece of copper wire and a small glass bead. "What are you doing?" the radio operator hissed. Bulge didn't answer. With practiced movements, he unscrewed the eyepiece of his sniper scope and inserted the strange copper coil and glass element, a modification no Army armorer would ever authorize. A modification that, if discovered, would lead to court-martial. A modification he had carried with him across the Atlantic, hidden from everyone. "This isn't about orders anymore," Bulge whispered as he reassembled his scope. "It's about those men out there." He settled back into position, peering through his scope. What he saw made him smile slightly. Where before there had been darkness and shadows, now he could see heat signatures, the warm bodies of German soldiers moving in the pre-dawn gloom, completely unaware they were visible. No one in the 29th Infantry Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history, that a traditional Navajo hunting secret hidden inside a standard-issue scope would change how America fought in the darkness. Thomas Bulge was born on January 12, 1922, in a small hogan near Chinle, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. His grandfather, a respected elder named Hosteen So, raised him after his parents died during the influenza epidemic. Their home sat in the shadow of Canyon de Chelly, where the red rock walls told ancient stories of survival and resistance. As a boy, Bulge showed exceptional eyesight and patience. By age 10, he could spot a rabbit at 500 yards, distinguishing its brown fur from the similar-colored desert scrub. His grandfather recognized this gift and began teaching him traditional Navajo hunting methods. "The eye sees what it expects to see," Hosteen told him, "but our ancestors learned to see what others cannot." It was during these lessons that Bulge first learned about what his people called fire-seeing, a traditional technique using specially shaped crystals and copper coils that, when arranged properly, could detect the heat of animals in complete darkness. These primitive thermal detection devices had been used by Navajo hunters for generations, allowing them to hunt at night when game was more active in the desert heat. Bulge attended the government boarding school in Tuba City, where teachers tried to erase his heritage. They cut his long hair, forbade him from speaking Navajo, and gave him the English name Thomas. But at night he would sneak out with other Navajo boys to practice their language and share stories from home. While the school taught standard American subjects, Bulge continued his education in traditional knowledge whenever he returned to the reservation. In 1940, as war spread across Europe, Bulge was working as a mechanic in Flagstaff. When he heard about Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, he didn't hesitate. The next day, he stood in line at the recruiting office in Phoenix. The recruiter looked at his paperwork with surprise. "You've got perfect eyesight, son. Better than perfect, actually." Bulge just nodded. What he didn't mention was how he'd learned to see. The years spent tracking across desert landscapes, the techniques his grandfather had taught him about following heat rather than just visible light. Basic training at Fort Benning proved challenging, but not in the ways the drill instructors expected. Begay was quiet, disciplined, and physically fit from years of desert life. What frustrated him was how the Army taught marksmanship, mechanical and by the book, with none of the natural integration with environment that he had learned. During rifle qualification, Begay scored so high that the rangemaster accused him of cheating and made him shoot again while being closely observed. He scored even higher the second time. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that, Private?" the sergeant demanded. "My grandfather taught me," Begay replied simply. His exceptional scores earned him a place in the Army's sniper training program, where he excelled. But it was during night training exercises that his instructors noticed something odd. Begay could somehow locate targets in near total darkness with significantly better accuracy than any other trainee. "It's like he can see in the dark," one instructor commented. His fellow trainees were initially skeptical of the quiet Navajo. Some made the usual racist remarks, calling him chief, or assuming he couldn't understand complex instructions. But as training progressed, their attitudes changed from derision to a grudging respect, and finally to something approaching awe when they witnessed his abilities in the field. "Begay doesn't miss," became a common refrain among the men. What none of them knew was that during his few private moments, Begay was experimenting with something he had brought from home, small pieces of quartz crystal and copper wire that, when properly aligned in front of his eye, allowed him to detect subtle heat differences. He had no idea that soon those instincts and that secret knowledge would be all that stood between life and annihilation for hundreds of American soldiers. By early 1944, the Allied forces were preparing for the greatest military gamble in modern history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Operation Overlord would commit more than 150,000 troops to a massive amphibious landing along the coast of Normandy. The fate of World War II hung in the balance. The initial landings on June 6, 1944, had succeeded, but at terrible cost. Now, 9 days later, American forces were struggling to break out from their beachheads and push inland. The hedgerow country of Normandy, with its ancient field boundaries formed by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, created perfect defensive positions for German troops. The 29th Infantry Division, known as the Blue and Gray Division, had landed on Omaha Beach and was now engaged in the grueling battle to secure the critical transportation hub of St. Lo. Every crossroads, every village became a bitter fight. German snipers and machine gun teams used the hedgerows to create interlocking fields of fire that cut down American advances. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were rushing reinforcements to the area. Elements of the tough Panzer-Lehr Division were moving into position to counterattack. If they succeeded in pushing the Americans back, the entire Allied foothold in Normandy would be threatened. Major General Charles Gerhardt, the 29th Division's commander, ordered his units to secure key terrain features before the German armor arrived. The 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment was tasked with taking a strategic crossroads near the village of Le Mesnil-Durand, but they had run into heavy resistance. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Warfield, had deployed his companies in a frontal assault, but German machine guns positioned along a ridgeline had stopped the advance cold. By nightfall on June 14th, 3 American companies were pinned down in open ground with dozens of wounded men unable to be evacuated. Colonel Warfield's options were limited. Artillery support was prioritized for units facing the expected Panzer counterattack. Air support was grounded due to the poor weather. A frontal infantry assault would result in unacceptable casualties. "We wait for dawn," Warfield told his staff. "No movement, no firing. We'll bring up the heavy mortars at 0800 and try to suppress those machine guns." The order went out. Maintain positions, tend to the wounded if possible, but no offensive action until the morning artillery barrage. Radio silence was to be maintained to prevent German direction-finding equipment from locating command posts. Among those who received this order was Lieutenant Michael Riley, commanding a scout sniper section attached to B Company. Riley had 4 two-man sniper teams positioned along the American front. One of those teams, situated on the far right flank, consisted of PFC Thomas Begay and his spotter, Corporal David Miller. Riley visited their position shortly after midnight. "Orders are to sit tight," he told them. "No shots. Command is worried about giving away positions." Miller nodded in agreement, but Begay remained silent, studying the darkness through his binoculars. He could see the faint muzzle flashes as German machine guns fired occasional bursts to keep the Americans pinned down. He could also see the wounded men in no man's land, some moving, some ominously still. "Those men won't last until morning, sir," Begay said quietly. "I know," Riley replied, "but orders are orders. We move, we fire, we give away our positions, and the Krauts will hit us with everything they've got." After Riley left, Miller looked at his partner. They had been together since sniper school, an unlikely pair. Miller, a former baseball player from Chicago, and Begay, the soft-spoken Navajo. "I know that look," Miller said. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." "Court-martial isn't worth it." Begay remained silent, counting the machine gun positions he had identified during daylight. 6 nests, 12 to 18 men. If they reinforced overnight, the morning attack would walk into a slaughter. As rain began to fall harder, Begay made his decision. He would not wait for dawn. He would not obey an order that meant certain death for the wounded men lying in the mud. But to act, he would need to use the secret he had carried with him from Arizona. The rifle that PFC Thomas Begay carried that night was a Springfield M1903A4, the standard sniper variant of the venerable bolt-action rifle that had served American forces since the early 20th century. Fitted with a Weaver Model 330 C-scope, it was accurate and reliable in daylight. Night shooting in World War II was practically impossible with standard equipment. The rudimentary infrared technology that existed was bulky, experimental, and restricted to specialized units. No ordinary sniper had any means of effectively engaging targets in darkness. No ordinary sniper, that is, except Thomas Begay. As midnight passed and the rain continued to fall, Begay prepared for what could be his last act as an American soldier. If caught modifying his weapon, he faced court-martial. If caught disobeying direct orders, potentially worse. "What are you doing?" Miller whispered, as Begay unwrapped the small bundle he kept in his breast pocket. "Something my grandfather taught me," Begay replied softly. He carefully unscrewed the eyepiece of his scope. "You can't mess with that," Miller hissed. "The armorer will have your hide." Begay continued working, his fingers deft despite the cold. From his bundle, he removed what looked like a small coil of copper wire, twisted in a specific pattern, and a piece of quartz crystal that had been ground into a precise shape. The design was based on principles handed down through generations of Navajo hunters. The copper coil would capture minute differences in heat radiation, while the crystal would magnify and focus them. "My people have hunted in darkness for centuries," Begay explained quietly as he worked. "We learned to see the heat of animals, not just their shapes." Miller watched in disbelief as Begay inserted the copper coil and crystal into the scope tube, positioning them precisely between existing glass elements, then reassembled the eyepiece. "That's not possible," Miller said. "You can't just see heat." Begay raised the rifle to his shoulder and peered through the modified scope. What he saw wasn't the crisp daylight image a normal scope would provide. Instead, he saw hazy outlines, warmer objects appearing as lighter areas against the cooler background. The effect was crude compared to modern thermal imaging, but in the context of 1944, it was revolutionary. "I can see them," Begay whispered. "All 6 positions. They're bringing up ammunition right now." Miller shook his head. "Even if you can see them, which I doubt, you can't engage. Orders." Begay lowered his rifle and looked at his partner. "My grandfather taught me that a warrior's first duty is to protect his people. Those wounded men out there are our people." He pointed to the field where American wounded lay. "If those machine guns open up at dawn, they all die. And if you start firing now, you'll give away our position, and we might all die," Miller countered. "Not if they can't tell where the shots are coming from," Begay said. He reached into his pack and pulled out a length of rubber hose, part of a gas mask he had modified. "We move 200 yards to the left, fire from there. I take out the gunners, then we move again, another position. We keep moving after each shot." Miller stared at his partner. This plan wasn't just risky, it was borderline suicidal. And yet, if it worked— "How many men do you think are out there wounded?" Begay asked quietly. "At least 30, Miller replied. "Maybe more? And how many will still be alive at 0800? Miller didn't answer. They both knew the truth. The wounded needed evacuation now, not 4 hours from now. "You don't have to come," Begay said finally. "Tell them I went out alone." Miller cursed under his breath. "Like hell. If you're going to get court-martialed, I might as well join you." He grabbed his binoculars. "But you'd better be right about that scope of yours." The two soldiers gathered their equipment and began crawling through the wet underbrush, moving laterally along the American line. Rain masked the sound of their movement as they pushed 200 yards to the west, finding a new position with a clear line of sight to the German emplacements. Begay set up his rifle, using a fallen log as a stable platform. He attached the rubber hose to the muzzle, a crude but effective suppressor that would reduce the muzzle flash and distort the sound of the shot. Then he peered through his modified scope. The nearest German machine gun nest was manned by 3 soldiers. Through his heat-sensing scope, Begay could see them clearly, warm bodies against the cooler background. One was behind the MG-42 machine gun, while 2 others were arranging ammunition boxes. "First target, MG nest at the junction of 2 hedgerows," Begay whispered. 3 men. I'll take the gunner first." Miller raised his binoculars but could barely make out shadows. "I can't confirm. It's too dark." "Trust me," Begay said. He controlled his breathing, feeling his heartbeat slow. The rain continued to fall, but his focus narrowed to the warm figure behind the machine gun. Begay squeezed the trigger. The shot made a dull thump, nothing like the crack of an unsuppressed rifle. Through his scope, Begay saw the gunner collapse. "Hit," he said calmly, working the bolt to chamber another round. The 2 other Germans were now moving in confusion, unable to determine where the shot had come from. Begay fired twice more in rapid succession. Both men fell. "Jesus," Miller whispered. "You got them. I could barely see movement, but they're down." Without wasting time, Begay was already packing up. "Move, 200 yards, same direction." They crawled through mud and wet grass, reaching their second firing position 10 minutes later. From here, Begay could see 2 more machine gun nests. The Germans were now alert, but they were scanning the area directly in front of them, not expecting fire from the flank. Again, Begay set up, aimed, and fired. One by one, the German gunners fell. By the 3rd position, word had spread among the German lines that they were under attack, but they couldn't locate the source of the fire. Flares went up, illuminating the battlefield with harsh white light, but by then, Begay and Miller had moved to their 4th position. In less than 40 minutes, Begay had neutralized all 6 machine gun positions, 18 German soldiers eliminated without a single return shot fired at their position. The American wounded in the field were now able to be reached by medics who had been waiting for an opportunity to move forward. As they crawled back toward the American lines, Miller grabbed Begay's arm. "How did you do that? How could you see them so clearly?" Begay was silent for a moment. "The copper coil creates a field that can detect differences in heat. The crystal magnifies those differences so the eye can see them. My people have used similar methods to hunt at night for generations." That's impossible, Miller insisted. "That's science fiction stuff." "Not fiction," Begay replied. "Just knowledge your people haven't discovered yet." By 3 a.m., they had returned to their original position. Lieutenant Riley found them there, his face a mixture of anger and amazement. "I don't know what the hell you 2 did," he said in a harsh whisper, "but the Kraut's front line just collapsed. B Company was able to advance and secure the crossroads. with minimal resistance. He stared hard at them. I gave you direct orders, no firing. Miller looked at the ground, but Bigay met the lieutenant's gaze. With respect, sir, the wounded needed immediate evacuation. Riley continued to stare at them. Colonel Warfield is furious. He wants to know who authorized the action. He paused. I told him I did. Both Bigay and Miller looked up in surprise. I don't know how you did it, Riley continued. The men are saying you can see in the dark, Bigay, that you're some kind of, I don't know, medicine man or something. He shook his head. Whatever you did, it worked. 27 wounded men were evacuated who would have died by morning. Bigay said nothing, his face impassive. The official report will state that a sniper team engaged enemy positions after identifying an imminent threat to our wounded personnel, Riley said. Nothing about disobeying orders, nothing about, he gestured vaguely at Bigay's rifle, whatever you did to that weapon. As dawn broke over the Normandy countryside, the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment had secured its objective. The expected German counterattack hit a position now fully prepared and reinforced. The action was later credited as a key factor in preventing the Panzerlehr Division from breaking through American lines. For Thomas Bigay, however, the night's work had just begun. His modified scope had proven its worth, but he knew that one successful mission would not be enough. The war was far from over, and there would be many more nights where American soldiers would need to see in the darkness. As B Company moved forward to secure their new positions, Thomas Bigay sat alone, cleaning his rifle. The small copper coil and crystal remained hidden in his scope, a secret that would soon change how America fought at night, if anyone would believe it. The story of what happened that rainy night in Normandy spread quickly through the ranks of the 29th Division. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the Navajo sniper who could see in the dark. Some claimed it was tribal magic. Others insisted it was just exceptional training and luck. Few knew the truth, and those who did, like Corporal Miller, found it hard to believe even though they had witnessed it firsthand. Lieutenant Riley brought Bigay to meet with Captain Howard Wright, the battalion intelligence officer, 2 days after the night action. Private, I need you to explain exactly how you engaged those targets in near-zero visibility, Wright said, studying Bigay across a makeshift desk in a bombed-out farmhouse. Bigay stood at attention. I observed heat signatures through my scope, sir. Wright exchanged glances with Riley. Heat signatures? Are you telling me you have some kind of infrared device? Not exactly, sir, Bigay replied. It's a traditional method my grandfather taught me. A combination of copper wire and crystal that can detect differences in temperature. Wright leaned back, skepticism evident on his face. Private, I've studied every optical system in our arsenal and in development. What you're describing is, well, it's not possible with current technology. With respect, sir, it's not current technology. It's very old technology. My people have used variations of it for hunting for generations. Wright looked at Riley, who shrugged slightly. The fact remains, sir, that Bigay engaged and neutralized 6 enemy positions in complete darkness with extraordinary accuracy. I witnessed 4 of the shots myself after catching up with them. I've never seen anything like it. Wright drummed his fingers on the desk. I'd like to examine your scope, Private. Bigay hesitated. His modification was unauthorized. Tampering with issued equipment was a punishable offense, but he had already crossed that line. Yes, sir, he said, handing over his rifle. Wright spent several minutes examining the scope, unscrewing the eyepiece and peering at the internal components. His expression changed from skepticism to confusion. This doesn't make any sense, he muttered. This arrangement of elements shouldn't work at all according to modern optics. He looked up at Bigay. Yet you claim it allows you to see heat? Yes, sir, not as clearly as daylight, but enough to distinguish warm bodies from cool surroundings. Wright reassembled the scope and handed the rifle back. Ordinarily, I'd have you written up for unauthorized modification of military equipment. He paused. But these aren't ordinary circumstances. I want you to show this to someone. 2 days later, Begay found himself in a meeting with a civilian scientist attached to the Army Ordnance Department. Dr. Samuel Hirsch had been sent from England specifically to investigate reports of the night sniper incident. "Fascinating," Dr. Hirsch said as he examined Begay's scope modifications. "The copper coil creates a crude thermoelectric effect, and the crystal serves as both a filter and magnifier." He looked up at Begay. "Who taught you this?" "My grandfather, sir. He learned it from his grandfather." "And your people have used this for how long?" "As long as anyone can remember," Begay replied. "We hunt at night in the desert. Animals are more active after sunset when it's cooler." Hirsch made detailed notes and sketches. "This shouldn't work as well as you claim. The effect would be minimal with these materials." "There's a specific way to arrange the copper," Begay explained. "The pattern matters, and the crystal must be cut along certain planes." "Show me," Hirsch said, pushing paper toward him. For the next hour, Begay demonstrated how to shape the copper and position the crystal elements. Hirsch asked dozens of questions, taking copious notes. "Private Begay," he said finally, "what you've shown me is, quite frankly, extraordinary. It's a primitive form of thermal detection that, according to our scientific understanding, shouldn't be nearly as effective as you've demonstrated." He tapped his notebook. "I need to take this back to our research team immediately." "What happens now, sir?" Begay asked. "Now?" Hirsch smiled slightly. "Now we see if we can reproduce your results in a laboratory setting. And if we can, we might just have a breakthrough in night fighting capabilities." That night, Begay sat alone outside his tent, looking up at the stars. Corporal Miller joined him, offering a cigarette, which Begay declined. "So they're taking your idea back to the lab?" Miller asked. Begay nodded. Dr. Hirsch seemed excited. "And what did they give you for it? A promotion, a medal?" "Nothing," Begay said quietly. "It wasn't my idea to give. It belongs to my people. I'm just the messenger." Miller shook his head. "That's not how it works, Thomas. In this man's army, you should at least get credit." "Credit isn't why I showed them," Begay replied. "I showed them because it might save lives, like it did 2 nights ago." Miller was silent for a moment. "Those men would have died, you know, the wounded, if we hadn't acted." "I know." "So no regrets about disobeying orders?" Begay looked at his friend. "My grandfather taught me that sometimes the right path isn't the one others have marked for you. Sometimes you have to make your own trail." 3 weeks later, Begay was summoned to division headquarters. He arrived to find not only Dr. Hirsch, but also a full colonel from Army Ordnance, and a British officer he didn't recognize. "Private Begay," the colonel said, "Dr. Hirsch has shared your modification with our research team. We've tested it extensively." Begay stood at attention, waiting. "Initial results are promising," the colonel continued. "Not as effective as you demonstrated in the field, but definitely showing potential. The principles you've identified could lead to significant advances in night vision technology." Dr. Hirsch stepped forward. "What we don't understand is why your version works so much better than our reproductions. There must be some element you haven't shared with us." All eyes were on Begay. He thought carefully before speaking. "The copper must come from a specific source, and the crystal must be prepared in a certain way, with certain prayers." The colonel frowned. "Prayers? Private? We're talking about science here, not superstition." Begay met his gaze. "With respect, sir, my people don't separate the two. The method works because it's both knowledge and belief working together." The British officer spoke for the first time. "Rather like the Navajo code, wouldn't you say, Colonel? Sometimes what we dismiss as primitive contains wisdom we haven't yet grasped." He turned to Begay. "I understand you're not the only Navajo serving. There's a unit of code talkers in the Pacific." "Yes, sir. My cousin is one of them." "Well, Private," the colonel said, "we're establishing a special research unit to develop this technology further. We'd like you to join it, to work with Dr. Hirsch's team." Begay blinked in surprise. "Leave my unit, sir?" "Yes. This could be vital to the war effort. We need your knowledge." Begay thought of the men in his squad, of Corporal Miller and Lieutenant Riley. They had fought together, bled together. The bond between soldiers wasn't something easily broken. "With respect, sir, "I believe I can be more useful in the field," Bigoy said. "I can continue to use the technique in combat and train others directly." The colonel looked ready to object, but the British officer raised a hand. "Actually, that might be more valuable. Field testing under combat conditions would provide better data than laboratory work." After some discussion, a compromise was reached. Bigoy would remain with his unit but would be temporarily attached to a special reconnaissance platoon. He would train selected snipers in his techniques and document the results. By September 1944, a small group of snipers, 6 men in total, including Bigoy, was operating with modified scopes across the front lines of the U.S. First Army. They called themselves the Night Hunters, though no such unit officially existed in Army records. Their missions were classified, their methods unorthodox, but their results were undeniable. German units began reporting a new American capability, snipers who could somehow target German positions in complete darkness. One captured German officer called them ghost shooters, who killed without being seen. Meanwhile, Dr. Hirsch's team worked frantically to understand and improve upon Bigoy's traditional knowledge. Their early prototypes were bulky and less effective than Bigoy's simple modification, but they represented the first steps toward modern thermal imaging. On October 10, 1944, Thomas Bigoy led a night operation near the German border. His team of 6 snipers was tasked with eliminating a German observation post that was directing artillery fire on American positions. The night was moonless, with heavy cloud cover making conventional observation impossible. The German position was well defended, with overlapping fields of fire that would make a conventional assault costly. Bigoy positioned his men in a wide semicircle, each equipped with a modified scope. Using hand signals, he coordinated their fire. At precisely 23:30 hours, all 6 snipers fired simultaneously. Through his scope, Bigoy watched as the heat signatures of the German soldiers flickered and faded. Within minutes, the observation post was neutralized. American infantry advanced without losing a single man. Later that night, as they made their way back to American lines, one of the newer snipers, Private Joseph Wilson from Montana, asked the question that had been on many minds. "Bigoy, why did your people keep this secret? This technology could have made them rich." Bigoy continued walking, his eyes scanning the darkness. "My grandfather told me that knowledge is like water in the desert. You don't own it. You are merely its guardian for a time. You use what you need and preserve the rest for those who come after." Wilson shook his head. "Still seems like a waste. Could have patented it or something." "Some knowledge isn't meant to be owned," Bigoy replied quietly. "It's meant to be used when needed," then returned to silence. The other snipers fell silent, contemplating his words. In the distance, artillery illuminated the horizon, brief flashes that revealed the continuing brutality of the war. Each man knew that Bigoy's secret had saved countless American lives and taken numerous German ones. By November 1944, the Night Hunters had conducted over 30 successful operations. Their existence remained classified, known only to a select few officers and the men themselves. Dr. Hirsch's research team had made significant progress in understanding the principles behind Bigoy's modification. They had developed a prototype device that, while still crude, represented a major advance in thermal imaging technology. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. Under cover of bad weather that grounded Allied air power, German forces smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest. Bigoy and his team were attached to the 28th Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of the initial German assault. As American units fell back in disarray, the Night Hunters were tasked with a critical mission: locate the spearheads of the German advance and report their positions. In the snowy forests of Belgium, visibility was near zero. Heavy fog and snow showers reduced conventional observation to mere yards. But for Bigoy and his men, the heat signatures of German tanks and troops stood out clearly against the cold background. For 3 consecutive nights, they moved through German-held territory, identifying assembly areas, command posts, and fuel depots. Their intelligence allowed American artillery to target key German positions despite the weather. On the 4th night, December 19th, Begay and Wilson were observing a major road junction when they spotted a column of German vehicles, staff cars surrounded by armored vehicles. "High-value target," Wilson whispered. "Officers, maybe even generals." Begay studied the heat signatures through his scope. The configuration matched what intelligence had described as the command group of the 5th Panzer Army, one of the main German forces in the offensive. "We report this," Begay decided. "We don't engage." Wilson looked at him in surprise. "Are you kidding? This is a perfect shot. We could take out their entire command structure." "And give away our position to those 2 companies of infantry protecting them," Begay countered. "The information is more valuable. We need to get it back to headquarters." Before they could withdraw, however, a German patrol stumbled upon their position. In the brief firefight that followed, Wilson was killed and Begay wounded in the shoulder. Despite his injury, Begay managed to escape into the forest. For 2 days, he evaded German patrols, moving only at night when his modified scope gave him the advantage. His shoulder wound festered and fever set in, but he continued moving toward American lines. On December 21st, delirious with fever, he stumbled into an American outpost manned by elements of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, a town now surrounded by German forces. "Got intelligence!" Begay gasped before collapsing. "German command group, coordinates." The information Begay provided allowed Allied air forces, when the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, to target the German command elements with precision. The disruption to German communications contributed significantly to the failure of their offensive. For Thomas Begay, however, the war was over. His wound, now severely infected, required immediate medical attention. He was evacuated by air when Allied planes were finally able to land in Bastogne and eventually sent to a hospital in England. During his recovery, he was visited by Dr. Hirsch, who brought news of the research team's progress. "We've finally done it," Hirsch said excitedly, placing a bulky device on Begay's hospital bed. "A working prototype based on your principles. We've combined traditional optics with electronic elements to amplify the thermal detection capabilities. The Army is calling it Project Night Eye." Begay examined the device, much larger and more complex than his simple modification, with batteries and vacuum tubes attached to a conventional scope. "It works?" he asked quietly. "Not as well as your version," Hirsch admitted, "but it's consistent and reproducible. The scientific principles are sound even if we don't fully understand all the nuances of your traditional methods." He leaned forward. "The military is very interested, Begay. This could change night fighting forever." Begay nodded slowly. "My grandfather would say that all knowledge returns to its source eventually. The cycle completes." "There's something else," Hirsch said, pulling out an official-looking document. "The Army wants to recognize your contribution. There's talk of a medal, maybe even a commission." Begay looked out the window at the English countryside. "The other night hunters?" "Being recalled from the front for debriefing. Your team's work has been, well, remarkable is an understatement." "And Wilson?" Hirsch's expression sobered. "Posthumous Silver Star. His family will receive it." Begay closed his eyes briefly. "Good. He was a good man." After a moment, he looked back at Hirsch. "About the recognition, I don't need it. What I did came from my people, not just from me." "The Army doesn't quite work that way," Hirsch said with a small smile. "They like to pin medals on individuals." "Then tell them to acknowledge the source," Begay insisted. "The Navajo Nation, our knowledge." Hirsch nodded slowly. "I'll do my best. But you should know, much of this will likely be classified for years. The technology is too valuable." As winter turned to spring, Begay's wound healed, though he never regained full strength in his right arm. In April 1945, he was transferred back to the United States, assigned to a special training unit at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. There he worked with scientists and military specialists to further develop what was now officially called Project Night Eye. The crude thermal detection system that had begun with copper wire and crystal in a sniper scope was evolving into increasingly sophisticated technology. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, prototype night vision devices based partly on Buguet's principles were being prepared for deployment in the Pacific Theater. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August ended the war before these devices could be used in combat. For Thomas Buguet, the end of the war brought both relief and uncertainty. His official status remained in limbo, neither fully a soldier nor a civilian consultant. The work he had done was classified at the highest levels, leaving him unable to speak of it, even to his family. In September 1945, he received orders to report to the Pentagon. There, in a small, windowless conference room, he met with 3 generals and a civilian official from what would later become the Central Intelligence Agency. Private First Class Buguet, the senior general began, your contribution to the war effort has been reviewed at the highest levels. The technology derived from your traditional methods is now considered a matter of national security. Buguet said nothing, his face impassive. We're prepared to offer you an honorable discharge with a promotion to staff sergeant, a Silver Star for your actions in Normandy, and a substantial research stipend if you agree to continue working with our development team. And the condition? Buguet asked, sensing there was more. The civilian spoke for the first time. Complete confidentiality. No disclosure of your work, your methods, or the technology derived from them. To anyone, ever. Buguet considered this. My people's knowledge is being used, but they will receive no credit. National security requirements, the civilian said smoothly. Perhaps in time, decades from now, the classification may be lifted. And if I refuse, the generals exchanged glances. That would be unfortunate, the senior officer said. We'd prefer to have your continued cooperation, but the technology will be developed with or without you. Buguet understood the unspoken threat. His knowledge had already been taken. Now they were simply deciding whether to acknowledge him as its source. My grandfather once told me, Buguet said slowly, that the white man's way is to take what isn't given and call it discovery. He looked at each man in turn. What you've learned from my people's traditions will save many American lives. That is enough for me. He accepted their terms, signing the confidentiality agreements that would silence him for decades. In October 1945, Staff Sergeant Thomas Buguet received his Silver Star in a small private ceremony attended only by military personnel with security clearances. No press was present, no family members. No record of the citation was made public. 2 weeks later, he returned to the Navajo Nation, to the Red Rock Canyons and wide skies of his childhood. He told no one of what he had done, of how traditional Navajo knowledge had changed the course of modern warfare. As far as his community knew, he had served honorably like thousands of other Navajo code talkers and soldiers. He married a woman named Sarah from his clan, built a small house near his grandfather's land, and worked as a mechanic in the nearby town. They had 4 children, all of whom grew up hearing stories of Navajo traditions and history, but nothing of their father's secret war. In his workshop behind the house, Buguet occasionally tinkered with pieces of copper wire and crystal, remembering. Sometimes at night he would walk into the desert and look up at the stars, thinking of Corporal Miller, Private Wilson, and the other night hunters. He wondered what had become of Dr. Hirsch and the technology they had pioneered together. Meanwhile, in classified research facilities across America, scientists and engineers continued to develop thermal imaging technology. The principles that Buguet had demonstrated, detecting heat differences to see in darkness, became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated systems. By the 1950s, the first generation of military infrared night vision devices was deployed in Korea. By Vietnam in the 1960s, thermal imaging had become standard equipment for special operations units. None of these developments mentioned their origin in traditional Navajo hunting techniques. In 1972, Thomas Buguet received a letter from the Department of Defense His security agreement was being modified to allow limited disclosure of his wartime activities, though specific technical details remained classified. The letter included a brief note from Dr. Samuel Hirsch, now elderly but still consulting for military research programs. "Thought you might like to know," Hirsch wrote, "that the technology you showed us has saved countless lives. The most recent devices can detect a human body from 1,000 yards in complete darkness. Your grandfather would be proud." Bigay never replied to the letter, but that weekend he took his oldest son into the desert and for the first time showed him how to shape copper wire and cut crystal to detect heat in darkness. "This knowledge belongs to our people," he told his son. "It was never mine to give away, but circumstances required it. Now it returns to where it belongs." In 1977, a military historian researching specialized units of World War II stumbled across a cryptic reference to the night hunters in declassified documents. His inquiries led him to a retired colonel who had been a junior officer in Army intelligence during the war. "Oh yes, the Navajo thermal snipers," the colonel said. "Quite extraordinary what they accomplished. Changed night warfare forever, though you won't read about it in any official history." The historian tracked down Thomas Bigay, by then in his mid-50s and still living quietly on the reservation. When he knocked on Bigay's door and introduced himself, Bigay invited him in for coffee but declined to be interviewed. "There are some stories that aren't mine to tell," he explained, "and some secrets that still protect people." The historian persisted. "But the technology has been declassified. The basic principles of thermal imaging are now public knowledge." Bigay smiled slightly. "What's been declassified is what they learned, not how they learned it." He did, however, show the historian something he had kept for over 30 years, a small piece of copper wire, twisted in a specific pattern, and a crystal bead no larger than a pea. "This changed the course of a war," Bigay said simply. "Not because it was advanced technology, but because it was ancient wisdom applied in a new way." The historian published his article in a specialized military journal titled "The Night Hunters, Specialized Snipers in World War II." It mentioned Bigay by name, but included only vague references to enhanced night vision capabilities and traditional knowledge adapted for military use. Few people read it, and fewer still understood its significance. In 1983, Thomas Bigay received another letter, this one inviting him to a ceremony at the Pentagon. A new generation of thermal imaging technology was being unveiled, and the military wished to quietly acknowledge its origins. Bigay, now 61, made the journey to Washington with his eldest son. In a small auditorium, before an audience of military officers and defense contractors, the Secretary of Defense presented him with a plaque commemorating his unique contribution to night vision technology. The plaque contained no classified information, no specific mention of how Navajo hunting techniques had been adapted for warfare. To most of those present, it seemed a routine acknowledgement of a Native American veteran, perhaps one of the famous code talkers. After the ceremony, a young engineer approached Bigay. "Sir, I've worked on thermal imaging systems for 10 years, he said. "We've always been told the technology originated in the 1950s. He hesitated. "Is it true that you could see heat with just copper and crystal?" Bigay looked at the young man for a long moment. "The old ways often contain wisdom that the new ways rediscover," he said finally. "My people understood heat vision long before there were words like infrared or thermal imaging." "Could you show me?" the engineer asked eagerly. Bigay shook his head. "Some knowledge is meant to be carried, not displayed. Used when needed, then returned to silence." He paused. "But I will tell you this. The most powerful technologies are often the simplest. Sometimes we add complexity and call it progress, when what we've really done is obscure the truth." The engineer looked confused but nodded respectfully. That night, in his hotel room, Bigay told his son the full story for the first time. The night in Normandy, the wounded men saved, the secret missions with the night hunters. He described how his grandfather's teaching about hunting in darkness had been transformed into military technology without proper acknowledgement of its source. "I made my peace with it long ago," Begay told his son. "The knowledge saved lives on both sides. American soldiers who could see in darkness, and German soldiers who surrendered rather than die to unseen snipers. But they took it from our people," his son said, anger in his voice. "No," Begay replied gently. "Knowledge cannot be taken if it is freely given. I chose to share what I knew because men were dying. What others did with that knowledge afterward was their responsibility, not mine." "Will you ever tell the full story publicly?" his son asked. Begay looked out the window at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. "There are many kinds of truth," he said. "The truth of papers and records, which is what the military keeps. The truth of memory, which is what I carry. And the truth of heritage, which is what I pass to you." He turned to his son. "Which matters more?" In 1996, Thomas Begay died peacefully at his home on the Navajo Nation. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Silver Star from World War II, but gave no details of how he earned it. 2 months after his death, a package arrived at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. It contained a Springfield M1 1903A4 sniper rifle with a modified scope, along with a handwritten note. "This rifle belonged to my father, Thomas Begay. Inside the scope is the secret that changed how wars are fought at night. It is time for this knowledge to return to our people and be recognized." Museum curators, puzzled by the rifle's significance, eventually consulted military historians. When the scope was carefully disassembled, they found the copper coil and crystal beads still in place, the simple modification that had allowed a Navajo sniper to see heat signatures decades before modern thermal imaging technology. Today, advanced thermal imaging systems are standard equipment for military and law enforcement agencies worldwide. They use sophisticated electronics and digital processing to create detailed heat maps of their surroundings. Few who use these devices know that their conceptual ancestry traces back not to mid-20th century laboratories, but to ancient Navajo hunting traditions. In a small display case at the National Museum of the American Indian, Thomas Begay's rifle and scope are exhibited with a simple placard, "Traditional Knowledge in Modern Warfare: How Navajo Hunting Techniques Changed Night Vision Technology." Beside it sits a photograph of a young Navajo soldier in World War II uniform, his eyes focused on something distant, a slight smile on his face. Most visitors pass by without a second glance, unaware they are looking at the man who brought light to darkness and saved countless lives with knowledge his ancestors had carried for centuries. The true power of Thomas Begay's story lies not in the technology he shared, but in the wisdom behind it, in the choice to use ancient knowledge to protect others, in the humility to serve without seeking recognition, in the understanding that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not new discoveries, but old truths applied in new ways. Would you have done what Thomas Begay did? Would you have broken the rules, modified military equipment, disobeyed direct orders to save the wounded men no one else could reach? Would you have shared sacred traditional knowledge, knowing it might never be properly attributed to your people? These questions echo across time, challenging us to consider the nature of duty, the value of traditional wisdom, and the courage required to act when orders and conscience collide. As night vision technology continues to advance, with each new generation of devices more powerful than the last, the copper coil and crystal bead inside Thomas Begay's scope remain a testament to a simple truth. Innovation often comes not from inventing something new, but from seeing what has always been there in a different light. Share this story so others may remember what courage really means. Not just the bravery to face enemy fire, but the wisdom to know when rules must bend to save lives, and the humility to let your actions speak louder than any medal or commendation ever could.